I'll just see.
Yeah, I've sent it as well. No. Settings. I've sent it as well, so
Okay. So it has been received by our technical person, Arvind Bisht at Amritsar. So I guess we can begin.
yeah.
Mike, thank you. Thank you, Kiran ma'am. So finally, and thank you everybody for your patience. And so we formally begin. And I think there is recording as well. So I would request Arvind to kindly start the recording. So good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. And on behalf of the Center for Sustainable Habitat, Guru Nanak Dev University, I welcome everyone logged onto this virtual platform today. Today we celebrate 7th October as the World Metropolitan Day. It is observed by the UN Habitat to mark the anniversary of the Montreal Declaration on Metropolitan Areas in 2015. So metropolitan spaces are where a growing number of world's people live, work, care for each other. These are hubs of culture and innovation, and that generate over 80% of the world's economic output. They are also where the world's biggest challenges, such as urban growth, social segregation, climate emergency, are most deeply felt. The Montreal Declaration focuses on metropolitan areas in the context of UN Sustainable Development Goal 11, that is making inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable cities and communities. And within that, 11.4 to sustainably conserving and enhancing the natural and cultural heritage, biodiversity, and landscapes, and recognizing the important role played by the cultural and natural heritage, including biodiversity and landscapes, in defining the identity of citizens and human settlements in metropolitan areas, and the need to protect, rehabilitate, and promote resilient ecosystems. The declaration further identifies most essentially the role of the metropolitan areas, recognizing the role of metropolitan areas in sustainable economic, social, cultural, and environmental development of urban areas and countries, and to promote a better urban future. So, with this background, to understand the synergy between metropolis, heritage management, and sustainable development goals, we have amongst us a very distinguished speaker, a stalwart in the field, a figure well known across the globe, and an institution in himself, Professor Michael Turner. And at this point, I would like to invite Professor Kiran, a senior faculty member from the Guru Ramdas School of Planning, to please welcome Professor Dr. Michael Turner, our distinguished speaker for the day. Thank you. Professor Kiran, yours.
To ask you, am I audible to you? Yeah, okay. So, good evening, Professor Michael Turner and the August audience. All of you who have joined us in this webinar. It's indeed a great privilege and honor to have you, sir. And as Jana has introduced you as an institution by yourself in this field, especially. So it's my great privilege to actually to welcome you. And on the occasion of World Metropolitan Day, I should also compliment and felicitate the Sustainable Habitat Center for organizing this webinar, which shall be very useful to everybody here in this August audience. So just to introduce Professor Turner, he doesn't need an introduction though, but yet it might be nice to have a brief introduction. So Dr. Michael Turner is a practicing architect, faculty member, and head of the UNESCO chair in urban design and conservation studies at the department at Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design, Jerusalem. He serves on many professional academic bodies, providing expert advice over a range of subjects, focusing on urban heritage and its support for sustainable development. His European and Israeli research activities cover issues on education, heritage, peace, urban design, and resilient cities, and thereby contributing to academic fora and professional meetings all over the world. So, over the last 2 decades of involvement in UNESCO, he has greatly contributed to the debate around historical urban landscapes. He is currently also special advisor to the director of the World Heritage Center and accompanying the Modern Heritage of Africa initiative. Professor Turner is active in other global activities, including UNDRR Resilient City programs, one of the initiatives of our World Heritage Civil Society Network. And he's also coordinating a UN Habitat University partnership, that is the Metro Hub Consortium on Heritropolis, that is heritage and the metropolis. So, welcome, Professor Turner. We are really privileged to have you with us, and we look forward to your illuminating expert, guidance and talk on this topic of, current interest, and hope to greatly benefit from your enriching experience. So, Professor Turner is going to speak on heritage and metropolis in context of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you, sir, and we look forward. And with these words, I welcome all of you once again, and over to Jana. Jana?
Yeah. So before we begin, Professor Turner, I would like to give a few housekeeping rules, please. So you will notice that this is an open platform so that we can have a one-to-one discussion in the end with Professor Turner. And meanwhile, I would request all the participants to kindly be on mute with your video switched off. Please switch on both your video and unmute yourself as and when you're requested and prompted. And I also encourage you to type in your questions on the chat or use the Q&A as we proceed. And all the questions will be taken towards the end. And please don't forget to type in your name and representation as you do that. So thank you very much. So kindly be yourself on mute and your cameras off, please. Thank you. And having said this, it is an honor to have this opportunity to listen to Professor Michael Turner. And therefore, with no further delay, I give the floor to Professor Turner. Professor Turner, please enlighten us. Thank you.
Thank you. Will we have the screen for the presentation?
Arvind, can we have, yeah, it's.
Oh, right. Let's get full screen. Is that in the, could we have it on the full screen? I think you go into view.
We are trying, Mike. Just give us a bit of. This is a PDF, Mike. You're supposed to send us a PPT.
So just go into view. You can go into view and then, or start slideshow, present online.
Okay. Let me. Yeah, he's trying it. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
next slide. Okay, well, a bit of teething troubles. We're all set. First of all, it's a great honor to be here, and I thank Professor Ashwani Lokra for the invitation, and the representatives from the planning department that have given me this opportunity, not just simply of being with you, but also opening up this lecture series. I also thank Jana for the indefatigably of working on this, and I think that this will be an important opening for the issue of heritage, metropolis, and sustainability. So we're going to be looking, next slide, please. So we'll be looking at the metropolis, we'll be looking at heritage, and we'll be looking at sustainability. And we'll try to set the scene for what will happen in the whole series. The actual relevance of the word metropolis, coming from the Greek meaning mother and city, is very, very important for us to understand. And for us in the urban field, the term was in fact coined by Patrick Gerardis, who's very important both to you in India and myself in Israel and Palestine, about the importance of Patrick Geddes in planning in our two countries. And he actually coined it in the book of the Cities in Evolution, and it was later in Oswald Spengler in his 1918 book, and also in 1938 of the Lewis Mumford. But essentially it was used as a derogatory term, as the ills of the city, and which was actually taking place. Next slide. So it actually became even more important with the film of 1927, which looked very much as coined the word, which came with mixed reactions, whether people liked it or not. But it was actually set in a futuristic urban dystopia and follows the attempts of Freda, a wealthy son of a city master, and a saintly figure to the workers, to overcome the vast gulf separating the classes in the city. Again, it was a reaction to the social ills which were taking place around this time. Next, please. But what we look at essentially at the metropolis nowadays is the city of the future. It is left then the social forms, and in fact it becomes then a potential opportunities for the future. Next. And we can see it in different forms, and yet we look at them and we see they all look the same. Next. Whether it is from Toronto, Taipei, or Warsaw, or Singapore, it is all about then the high development, the tall buildings. Next. But I'd like to stop on this one from Tel Aviv. And when we look at the metropolis from this view, it is not just simply the high buildings, but also the elements which are around it, the city, the open space, the actual connections, which we will then speak about within the next part of the presentation. So we're really looking at a series of revolutions which have taken place over the past centuries. There was a scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century, the Industrial Revolution, which created the cities in the 18th century, and then the reaction of the social revolutions of 1900, and the commercial revolutions after the Second World War, and the environmental revolution of 1972, which we will look in detail. And now we are actually within the digital revolution, which is creating then new changes. Next. So we can see that the scientific, industrial, and social revolutions were things which then developed within themselves, and that created also the relationship to the city. It was Pugin who actually hankered after the historic aspects of the city, whereas the social revolution was the garden city movement, which Geddes was so much part of as a reaction to that industrial revolution. Next. But we should really look also at another aspect, and that is the futurists. The futurists who looked at futurism was an artistic and social movement, very much political, which we could quite often disassociate with, but it emphasized speed, technology, youth, and violence, and objects such as the car, the aeroplane, and the industrial city. So the futurists actually turned the future from, in fact, just simply revolution into time and speed. Next. And this brought us into the environmental revolution of 1972 and the commercial revolutions. Next. And we begin to look at the digital revolution. And here it's worthwhile to really understand why the digital revolution is so important for us. In fact, it has changed our understanding from centralized hierarchies to distributed networks. That technology now empowers individuals rather than external hierarchies, even though hierarchies and bureaucracies do not innovate, free and empowered individuals do. Knowledge, innovation, spontaneity, and self-reliance are becoming increasingly valued and promoted. And this is where the importance of understanding this revolution in addressing the heritage and the metropolis. Next. So we spoke about the speed of change of the futurists. So let's look at, in fact, then what had happened with the Encyclopedia Britannica. In 1990, it made record sales. Can you imagine? In the year just over 2000, Wikipedia was born. And 10 years later was the last of the Encyclopedia Britannica being printed. So that was an amazing speed of change. It was exponential growth which was taking place, but it changed our understanding between data and knowledge, information and wisdom, and it was disruptive innovation. Next. So let's understand the speed of change, how it relates to the city. If we look then at the book of James Burke, who identified the day that the universe changed, he looked at how the cholera moved from Calcutta to Sunderland in the period over just over 10 years. In fact, it moved at the speed of about 8 kilometers a day over 10 years. Can you imagine then the speed of change and what was happening? Next. As opposed to the timeline of the COVID-19 pandemic, which moved around the world in 8 months. So we're seeing exactly that it is not just simply change that we're looking at, is the issues of speed. Next. So in understanding the speed of change, we have to then really unpackage the city. So if we look at the speed of change of clothes, I would change my clothes each day, and I might change my fashion each year, which is very, very different about the interiors of our rooms of our cities, and very different than the neighborhoods. They change a little bit different of time. The monuments take an even longer time to change, while cities, their form is very difficult to change. So therefore, we begin to understand that change in our cities is then really a much more complex issue. It's not monolithic. Next. And the change which actually we're looking at then is really exponential. Thomas Friedman, in a seminal lecture which he gave to the United Nations, he actually spoke about what happened in 2007. 2007 for us, he did not say this, he spoke about 2007 was the digital change, the fact that the price of chips went down, we had Kindle, we had all these different things happened in 2007, but for us, that was the year that the UN declared that more people were living in cities than were not living in cities. Now, but that was our amazing point of change that we actually have to relate to. So we actually have to understand, therefore, the rate of change and about looking at the S curve of what happens with technologies. There's exponentiality which takes place, which we are at the crux of the time. Next. So we now move on to, we understood exactly, there is a metropolis. Metropolis is part of urbanism. Urbanism is then changing. There's speeds of change which are taking place. And by it, we've got lots of mechanisms. And it's these mechanisms, we have to be careful, must be serving us. They're not objectives or aims in themselves. They are means to an end about addressing the issues of the city. So I've put this slide, they're looking at the transformative power of urbanization, the city as a cultural construct. And you can see from the Sustainable Development Goals, we can see GIAHS, the global international agricultural heritage systems. We're looking at the climate change. We're looking at UN Habitat, Man and Biosphere, World Heritage, Intangible. We've got so many different mechanisms which are all in their silos addressing specificalities. Our challenge is to get all this and put them together into one structure. Next. So 1972 was the environmental revolution. And what happened is the UN Conference on Human Environment, the Stockholm Conference, this in fact put the word environment on the international agenda. But it was also the same time that was World Heritage Convention. And the World Heritage Convention, people think about World Heritage sites, and the answer is no, they're not just sites, there's also other aims. And in the aims, it says to adopt a general policy to give cultural and natural heritage a function in the life of the community and integrate the protection of that heritage in comprehensive planning programs. In other words, heritage was then a means to an end, which was the first aim of the World Heritage Convention. So we have to see that the environmental conference of 1972 came as a basis as for the World Heritage Convention, and it was in fact the people of nature, not the people of culture, that generated this change. Next. Here we can see the heritage and the function of the community. Next. Which brings us on to sustainability. So environment also started to mean something, but if we're talking about sustainable development, we then have what was called the Brundtland definition, which was Mrs. Brundtland here, and they had Our Common Future, 1987, and it was the concept of needs, the idea of limitations opposed by the state of technology, and that sustainable development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations. Next. But we have to challenge this because, in fact, why do we really... Next. What do we mean by generations? And then Karl Mannheim, in his seminal paper, actually spoke about then an understanding of different components of generation. Do we speak about a generation biblical, or do we speak about it as a location? Do we speak about it as an actuality? The post-war generation, the baby boomers, the flower generation, the X, the Y, the Z. Okay, it's no longer over time, but it references then actualities. It could also be a unit of groups of people, a generation which could be around the world. But generations of technology hardly manage 12 months. So we're talking about generations. What do we really mean? Next. So I'd like to then put on the table here is that we actually then say that David Reed questions whether it is meaningful to talk of sustainable development when we have no certainty of the needs of future generations. He's questioning this idea that we must leave something for future generations. How could the generation of 1987 understand the potential of the digital change, about the smartphone, about how we're managing our cities? So he said, we have no certainty of the needs of future generations, and therefore the conditions as representing a sustainable state, how close we may be to such conditions. He implies that we need to reconsider whether this is an imprecise idealism unchecked by reality. So I must admit, that's very convincing. I think that we can almost agree to the fact that we have to rethink exactly what this is. I wonder whether you could put in the chat whether you agree to this, to David Reed's challenging that we don't need to think about future generations. It's not even relevant for us to think about the future generations. We don't have their technology, their understanding of solving it. Let's live for the present. Okay, if you've got some comments, yes or no on that on the chat, let's see what you've got to say. Next slide. Which brings us well, if that is not where we're going, then my thoughts as follows. Sustainability is not just in time, but in place. In other words, and this is where the metropolis is going to be really important. In other words, what happens is that the city and its periphery, its hinterland, one must sustain the other. There is a balance. So sustainability is not between time, but between places and between peoples. And that might be more relevant for us to answer than Pete Reith's comments. So we've moved from the mechanisms, from tens of mechanisms of UNESCO, of UN, of activities, and now focusing just on the Sustainable Development Goals. But we need two other mechanisms to actually work together. The first one is the historic urban landscape of UNESCO, and the second one is the new urban agenda of UN Habitat. Historic urban landscape came before the Sustainable Development Goals, whereas the new urban agenda came after the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have to begin to understand then, we've got a series of texts which allow us then to address the issues of the metropolis in the city. Next. So the first one is then the historic urban landscape recommendation. And that is very much started to move heritage away from the idea, therefore, of monuments, and to build up this understanding of what is urban heritage and how do we deal with it. So therefore, it is then defined by historic layering of values produced by successive and existing cultures, and an accumulation of traditions and experiences. And it goes beyond the notion of the historic center or ensemble. Now that's where the metropolis comes on board. It is beyond the historic center, beyond the city or ensemble, to include the broader context and geographic setting. So the context might be, it is cultural context and its natural setting, but this is where the historic urban landscape already in 2011 developed this issue. Next. And here we can see also the various attributes in paragraph 9, that this wider context includes topography, geomorphology, natural features, infrastructures, land use patterns, social cultural practices, and intangible dimensions. You'll see that it tried to go beyond the monument as a piece of architecture, that to actually understand then the urban relationships. Next. It spoke about layering, and here it is very interesting to speak about archaeological layering, but it was also then the approach before computers of designing with nature of Ian McHarg, who spoke about layers of understanding, and that's how we work. We work with computers and mapping, and we have layers. But layers also needs continuity. We have to then understand there are visible layers and hidden layers. We're impervious layers. We have transparent layers. We have new layers. We have synthetic layers. All these layers have different ways of interrelationship between the parts. And it's our way of then analyzing and understanding the city. Next. It is also deals with continuity, and it also deals with then the city in multiple parts, its center, the inner center, the peri-urban areas. And this is where the metropolis then becomes a new form. It is not just this simple singularity of a center, but it is also the polynuclear part, which we're going to then look at as we move on into the metropolis and its heritage. Next. So we're going to be looking over this lecture series, as a series, all the 17 goals. Not all of them have got high relationship to urbanism, but they've all got some relationship, whether it is in fact food, whether it is then creating jobs, whether it is then promoting well-being. These are the indirect references to culture. Sometimes the word culture is mentioned, but our main focus of which our prism by which we're looking at will be that of goal 11. And then that will obviously will then provide then the relationships about looking at all the future of these lecture series. Next. So in goal 11, there is a target. Okay. And the target says, strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. So it's a target, it's not a goal. Next. And the target is there to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. In other words, in the Sustainable Development Goals, there's no aim to safeguard heritage. It is a means to an end. How does protecting heritage make our cities safe? How does it make them resilient? How does it make them inclusive? How does it make them sustainable? This is really an integrative challenge about how we then relate to heritage. It doesn't mean to say that there's no need or no room for safeguarding heritage per se, but that's another subject. We need people who are all the time just looking at heritage, not thinking about anything else. That's also important knowledge which we need. But what the Sustainable Development Goals actually says is the holistic approach of actually bringing all this together into one part. Next. But then people began to think that this is not good enough. And they said there's no goal for culture, which is exactly why we now have, Jana has put on the table here the whole series looking at them all, because we don't have one. And it was Amartya Sen, I like to bring on our Indian Nobel Prize winner, who is in fact for urban economics. And he spoke that cultural matters are integral parts of the lives we lead. If development can be seen as enhancement of our living standards, efforts geared to development can hardly ignore the world of culture. Next. Which brought about the next question. So they said, culture, okay, it should be a fourth sphere, a fourth pillar, culture in sustainable development. There were other people who said, no, culture for sustainable development, it should be just as the point of connection. And there were other people who said, no, culture must embrace everything. It's not another pillar. It is just simply embracing everything. It is something which pulls everything together. So there were the group of people who said, as I said, there should be a fourth pillar or fourth sphere to sustainable development beyond economics, social and environment. And there are other people who said, no, there are other ways of actually doing it. I don't know whether you'd like to put in the chat, how many of you would go for a fourth pillar, culture should be a fourth pillar, or we say, no, we're quite happy that culture is everywhere. It doesn't need to be a pillar within itself. This is very important position to understand, because this will affect exactly how you then relate then to heritage and the metropolis and our attitudes to sustainability. Next. It's making our cities safe, inclusive, resilient and sustainable. Safe is obvious. Okay, how do I create identities that people feel comfortable in the city? How is it then inclusive? Yes, how do I bring people together of different castes, perhaps? How do I bring people together as sustainable? That's what it's all about. So the question is, what is resilience? What is resilience? It is then a most important part is that it is in fact the importance of redundancy. Nature works in very, very different ways. We tend to do programs. We actually put program and say, yes, we need to have a program. How many people are going to be living in the city? How many people are working in the city? But in fact, the actual approach of nature is as follows. It has lots of irrelevant things. The mango tree has lots of flowering. And from the mango, very small amount is actually turns into fruit. if in fact then nature would actually work on programmatic structures, if something happened, it would be a catastrophe. So there is what is called then redundancy hypothesis. We build into our cities lots of alternatives. So if we only have one way to go from my house to work, and then suddenly there's an earthquake, or there's flooding, or there's an activity, or something needs to be done, I'm stuck. So in fact, the resilience is something which works against then detailing too much about what we need to do, opening up alternatives, opening up options, opening up different ways of doing things and receiving them within understanding it. The more we have then the capacity which the metropolis gives is then importance. And I think that the redundancy hypothesis is an important aspect of understanding and designing the city. Next. And people have then looked into how do we measure city resilience, areas that drive resilience. So they took economy, governance, society, and environment. I show it mainly because I will leave with you the presentation so you can actually spend time looking at it. But you can actually see over here that you have different aspects about translating this understanding into the city parts. Next. And we move on. So the first part was then arguments and discussion about whether culture should be a fourth pillar or fourth sphere within the sustainable development. And then what happened was then the new urban agenda, UN Habitat, responsible for goal 11, started detailing a lot of the activities. And then they actually brought on board, therefore, UNESCO came on board with culture, heritage, and the future. And that was really something very important. And it was a seminal document, which I always encourage people to look at. Next. The actual new urban agenda brought on culture and cultural, incredible. You know, they already said that here, recognizes that culture should be taken into account in the promotion and implementation of sustainable production. We include culture as a priority component of urban plans. I rest my case. Next. And we see that culture as a noun appears in 7 different times: a source of enrichment, affordable access, promote dialogue of culture, indigenous cultures. Next. And it appears in 17 times as an adjective, being an enabler for sustainable development, cultural interaction, cultural development, cultural diversity, cultural expressions, cultural contribution, cultural infrastructure. I just looked at cultural and did find and found 17 different contexts, there's many relationships, to understand exactly how culture can be part and parcel of understanding our city. Next. The new urban agenda structured itself on 3 different forms: the core dimensions, the means of implementation, and monitoring and reporting. And I think that again, it's then, these are mechanisms for us to manage the city. Next. To look at one particular aspect, it's very beautifully done in an illustrated example. You can see you can see that here, core dimensions of the new urban agenda, means of implementation, and there are detailed ideas to actually come on board. Next. And it goes even more details. You can see they take intervention mechanisms, urban design. So we've got lots of ways forward to be bringing together of sustainability and understanding it better into the metropolis. Next. So we now move on to the metropolis. And this is then in the field of UN Habitat. And therefore, they've actually looked at the farm. There was almost 2,000 metropolises, and then representing 60% of the world's urban population. Next. And they define the metropolis not by numbers, but by function. So therefore, the idea, therefore, it is might be commuting zone. It is then those which are economically and socially linked to the city. So we can add to the sustainable boundaries, open spaces, food, how can we quickly get food into the city is also part in defining the metropolis. It relates to the linkages between rural and urban and the process of change with cynicism. Next. So metropolises will represent the most important human settlement typology. So we actually, a new metropolis will arise every 2 weeks in the next 15 years for a total of 500 new metropolises. These are the facts from UN Habitat. Next. So we've just spoken about then the importance of that it is beyond the city. It includes then the urban and rural hinterland. And this means that we need to understand this frizzy edge, which then opens up around what we're actually looking at. And this edge which happens needs to be understood. It's not straight. It is completely fractal, in as Mandelbrot spoke about. And then he speaks about then that the edges of us understanding of geometry is such that there's the theories of roughness and self-similarity in nature. Nature doesn't like straight rulers. That belongs to us humans. It is more the spirituality which has the curve, which has all these aspects. And the relationships of understanding the city and its nature is in the fact that it is not then a straight edge. Next. Which means that we have to look at culture and nature. And again, we have then a series more of texts. We have the Ramsar document, we have Man and Biosphere, we have World Heritage, we have Urban Protected Areas of IUCN, we have food, the globally important agricultural heritage systems. All these then become texts by which we can then manage, and we bring to the table what people are really looking in their silo. And what we need to do is to bring all this great knowledge to a more integrative and holistic approach. Hello? Next. And this is done through the process of cynicism. In other words, the city grows. If we were to look here at something really small in Hampstead, those of you who might know London, London was very small, and it grew, and it engulfed each of the villages around, and the villages kept on their identity. This idea of cynicism is an essential part of understanding the processes of change, the speed of change, and how we relate to it. Next. And this idea of cynicism then creates not just simply a center, it creates the polynuclear metropolis, because therefore all these little villages which are now becoming engulfed have their nuclei, have their parts. And this is the way then the heritage and its management takes place. There was also a very interesting research on Jaipur, which I think that you will know better than I do. Next. So this then makes us understand then the form of the metropolis. The traffic in towns of Buchanan looked at Washington and looked at the potential of development of which cars and city affect then the relationships around the city of Washington. Next. We can actually then look at how a town called Alcan developed then. Milton Keynes developed. We then develop forms of city and exactly their relationships and how that affects, therefore, the metropolis. Next. And this brings us on to the understanding of exactly how we then see the city as a polynuclear or multipolar or sprawl, or monocentric, or a mixture of them all. And this is the way that, in fact, the dynamics of change that we begin to understand, and then actually putting then the heritage into each of these parts. Next. So the mega region becomes therefore even a problem. It's a source of confusion, a lack of understanding of functional as opposed to morphological issues. This was Peter Hall, the famous Sir Peter Hall, who in fact got us to understand a little bit better about the city. Next. So what are the challenges for the decade of action? So we say that 2/3 of the world may be living in cities, 2/3 of the 2/3 will be living in metropolises. But that's not exactly correct. It should be, if the current trend continues, then almost 2/3 will be living in cities as defined now. Two factors to rethink. Is the trend going to continue? Did COVID change the trend? And will the trend in the subcontinent of India, being an agrarian format, create then a new form? Do we have that capacity? And do we define the city as now? No, it is now the metropolis. It's a mindset change, mainstreaming urban-rural heritage in the metropolis. Next. And therefore, we need to know that looking at the heritage then moves from monuments to include living cities. Next. Which means that we now have to define urban heritage. And I've then come up with the proposal of defining urban heritage as urban archaeology, urban areas or fragments of the city, and urban form. Next. So urban archaeology is essentially then an archaeology in the city. Or it could also be where archaeology gives us then understanding of an urban form, militos, or in fact, Fatimir Sikri. This is in fact, we learn from the archaeology about urbanism, not necessarily about the particular buildings. Next. The urban area is then not just simply the buildings, but the area comprised of the building structures and open spaces, which have then cohesion value from landscape, architectural, historic areas. So therefore, they are parts of the city, not just simply the whole city itself. Next. So therefore, it could be the product of a specific period of functional culture. It could be like the 7 cities of Delhi. So each section is a specific period. It could be a specific function. Next. It could also be then a layered footprint, that therefore it's one on top of the other. Next. And finally, then we're looking at urban form. What is the form of the city? Let's look therefore at the examples. Next. Look at this. So therefore, the value of urban heritage is in the form. We could take down all the buildings of Palmanova, put new buildings in, but keep the form. Yes or no? Yes, that is the value of the form. No, but also the buildings are important. So, but that is then the way that we have to unpackage the understanding, take each part and put it together again. So therefore, the understanding of form as a value, the urban form, we can look at next, of which we can see more forms. We can see also the forms then of Indian format, about how it becomes critical to understand its form. Next. And we can see at Manhattan, again, we can take down all the buildings of Manhattan, the form of Manhattan, the grid structure which took place, and therefore the Central Park and these things. And Manhattan is revitalizing itself. So it is then a joint effort of form and areas and architectures. Next. So putting all this together is culture, cities, and identity. These were the concepts which were put together within a project which also Peter Hall relates to overlapping identity and culture. Next. And this looks at Amartya Sen, which speaks about identity and violence. And he said the more identities that you have, the less violence. I always give an example about where you are living now, is that on one hand, India and Pakistan could be on the edge of nuclear war, yet they play cricket together. So I tried to go do a test match in Mumbai. You couldn't get tickets for any money. So it just gives you an importance of multiplicity of identities, and that is in fact making cities safe and inclusive. So I think that this is a very important part about how in fact we're looking at the form of the city. Next. Which brings us on to identity, the neighborhood identity, and the metropolis then is not just simply a monolithic aspect, but then it is made up of all these different component parts. Next. And that is why we have set up then a program of which you at the university and at the center are members, that of Heritopolis, of which we believe, therefore, there must be heritage in the metropolis. There must be, bring this together so we actually merge these issues into a more holistic approach to identifying, therefore, the challenges that we have over the next years. Next. 15, we're already on 20. This was a slide from last month. So just gives you the excitement about the understanding about how we then deal with this. Last slide. I want to go back to the UN conference because only one president, except for the president of Sweden, spoke then, and that was Indira Gandhi. I do recommend that you read her text. It is an amazing text that she actually speaks about when you consider it was written in 1972. But I do think that one of the most important comments which she made is that the inherent conflict is not between conservation and development, but between environmental and reckless exploitation of man and earth in the name of efficiency. Perhaps you might want to recall resilience and the redundancy theory. But I think that therefore the higher standard of living must be achieved without alienating people from their heritage and without despoiling nature of its beauty, freshness, and purity so essential to our lives. I thank you for hosting me and sharing these ideas, and I wish you well. Thank you.
Wow, Professor Turner, that was amazing. That was amazing, and will be so difficult to summarize your thoughts. But before that, we have had some nice, some interesting comments on the chat box. Can you see them?
Yes.
It starts way up ahead. Let me see. Uh, yeah, Shubham Kumar. I think I was thrown out, so maybe there was a chat before that. There were two more chats before that, before Shubham Kumar.
Well, I think Kelvin de Chavez is.
Yes.
I must admit that I share that comment. I think so. But you have to realize that at UNESCO there was at the Rio there was they went along. We must have a fourth pillar. So I'm not on that hymn sheet. So but that's why I put the three alternatives there so you can see, and that is being debated, and that is where we need to rethink ourselves exactly, and especially with the preparing now the new the post sustainable development goals. This will be again another opportunity for discussing this.
Right. I think.
And
Yeah, please. There's one before that as well. There's one more before that.
The culture of sustainability to remain connected and embedded. I think so. I think so. But then the question is exactly how would one connect them? So I think that that is exactly, they can be, that is important. How to do it. Perhaps there is a multiplicity of solutions that we don't have. It's not one size fits all. But anyway, how do we deal with that? Jaipur, I visited twice Jaipur. It is a classical example of the leapfrog, which creates the cynicism, which generates the polycentricity, which say brings the importance of Heritopolis, of understanding the metropolis and its governance, not to take over top down, but to allow bottom up formula. So the metro hub of UN Habitat is then tries to then see this within this open part about it. So I'd be very interested to learn more about it and visit Jaipur together with Nita and see this leapfrogging in the area there. But that's also the issue of Jaipur, is not just simply the monuments which are inscribed, but also then the problems of the water structure and the environment which is taking around it, which is so critical. Is culture putting pressure on cities? Well, yes, the golden city where you are now is a prime example. Yes. Would we say that the pilgrimages there are putting pressure on the city? I see it as well in Jerusalem. So I share with you your ideas, is that when we have festivals, we are living in the city, we just stay at home. We just don't, we can't go out, or we leave. So therefore, yes, there is problem. But I think this is part of the excitement of addressing these issues. I wouldn't want to give up on it. So the Dean of Architecture, oh, great. I go with you on that. So I don't know whether you want me to go through all of them or whether we have time. So
no, we have time. If you have time, we have time. And in
yeah,
fact, I could request everybody to open their camera so that we can have one-to-one interaction, because Shubham Kumar has asked how can we elaborate. So I'm wondering what that means. And also, there's another comment by Nita Dubey. Can you see that? 5:09 p.m. Hence, there is a.
Well, anyway, so change is going to be taking place. And that is why urban heritage is dramatically different than monument heritage. The monuments, when we spoke about the historic urban landscape recommendation, I do recall the president of ICOMOS saying, change? We're not here for change. We're not interested in change. We don't believe in change. Well, the city doesn't work that way. So therefore, what are the urban values or the urban heritage values in the city which allow us then to come together in this aspect? And I don't know what the answer is, but in fact, I could say if the value is in layering, therefore there should be another layer of heritage. The architecture of today is the heritage of tomorrow. In other words, we have got a very important role about what we're doing, but we can't do with elbows like this. We have to then find out where is the way that we can also, do we then add it on top of it? So we have also, if I go to Zanzibar and look at the stone town, we've got then the African and we have the Indian layer. That is literally, the second floor is therefore exactly that. And we can see it as a layering, as opposed to the value of Delhi is in the 7 cities. So therefore, I'm in favor of having a really modern city somewhere, in identifying some place and really having it really beautiful. But I wouldn't want to do it instead of Lutyens. And I know there's lots of arguments about that. So I think that that is why the issue of transforming this ones, and sometimes we lose parts of our heritage, yes, but we have other heritage comes on board. I won't go into this because there's also the transposition of values which even I had as a student in the 1950s in post-war London are dramatically different than the values I have now, 60 years later.
Absolutely. So I'm going to take these two questions together. One together. Actually, the whole presentation kind of covered it all, but still, I'm going to focus because the basic question that comes up again and again is one that is asked by Neeta Dubey: how to balance between development and heritage. And Shubham Kumar is asking, can culture and sustainability go side by side? So, any concrete?
Well, I think that what the most important mindset change was culture for sustainable development, or culture as an enabler. In other words, if we're saying that sustainable development as its definition must include this idea of culture. So therefore it is the holistic approach which we're talking about. So if we can then manage it in this way, I think that this must be the way forward. Whether in fact we're going to and putting it into the dichotomy of then it's that or that is not where we need to be, and I think that is the role of sustainability. If we have a single answer, we don't have a single answer. That's why we study 5 years architecture, and that's why we need the Center for Sustainable Heritage, which you're working on, and that's why we're all around. That's our challenge as designers, as architects, as planners, to address these issues and create these dynamics of as opposed to coming up with a single formula.
So I'm going to take this another last question. This is a very interesting question, and I also, because for planners, you will never find a plain slate, fresh slate. You have to work around what is already built. So Ramnik is a final year student from BR GNU, our university here. And how can we as upcoming architects and urban planners represent an image / representation of a city onto a built up space? Yeah, that is the question always, like that planners will never find a clean slate to build on or the plan
Well,
on.
okay, that's true. That's why I spoke about then in understanding the city. Sometimes the form is stronger than everything. Christopher Wren, after the Great Fire of London, tried to make changes in the pattern of London. There were very few changes, even though that there was importance of building laws about of having bricks between each part to prevent fire. But there's certain things have difficulty. There's not parts of the city have great difficulty in changing. So I'd say that sometimes we do have opportunities. There are disasters which then demand new areas. There is the potential for new activities to take place. They might be smaller, they might be larger. I said, if I was in an area of a disaster, then suddenly we had to rebuild a whole village that was destroyed, I could then have a new form, or I could rebuild it itself, or I could just simply leave it as a ruin. Now, all these things are value decisions which can be made. So I think that I would go back to this one. The challenge of the upcoming architects, to my mind, is that the architecture today is the heritage tomorrow. That I think is your challenge. That there is that architecture, there is monument protection, but there's also therefore the dynamics of change and exactly how we manage it. What will be the legacy that you would then leave in 100 years? I've given this as in a studio. I said, I've given them, okay, the year is now 2122, and they're now actually analyzing what should be then heritage, retrospective.
True. That's very true. And I mean, if I would say that heritage is about inheritance, and in that sense, it is also present. if you agree with me, Mike. So my question, I have a question. My question to you is, why say culture as the fourth pillar or the core pillar or the whole thing? Why can't we say heritage as the holistic thing? Because if you look at it, it's always cultural heritage and natural heritage. So the holistic term is heritage. So my question is, why did we change this terminology over the years? Why are we talking about cultural agenda 2021, cultural urban future? So I'm saying, why aren't we using heritage as a holistic term?
I think, first of all, you're absolutely right. And that is why we didn't call it culture and the metropolis, we called it heritage and the metropolis, because we believe in that. And I think we're talking about what is our activities, which we need to be working now, is to in fact linking culture and nature. You can see that the metropolis is the potential for solving the problem. In other words, if I spoke about sustainability, it's not between generations. I mean, we can say that sustainability is between place. So therefore, if I've got the area around the city, which is market gardening, which is then solves the problem of reservoirs of water, which provides then the potential for recreation, for other livelihood. There's a symbiotic relationship between culture and nature, urban and rural. So we have to redefine our spaces. And it's not thinking outside the box, it's changing the shape of the box, which is exactly what we have to do. And I believe that we are moving ahead on that. And I think that is going to be our challenge. And I think that if we're working towards the World Urban Forum 2024 in Cairo, I think that I would put this very high on the agenda from our point of view. I think this is a really critical part.
Okay, Professor Turner, with that note, I will end the lecture. And I think that's a very good point, that it's not about thinking out of the box, but actually reimagining it and changing the shape of the box. So with that note, I would like to thank you very much, Professor Turner, immensely. And as you all have seen, that he's an institution in himself, for giving us this opportunity to listen to him, his words, his thoughts, his ideas, and the way he linked. I mean, it's very difficult to summarize him. This is not my first lecture that I'm attending of Professor Turner. The way he started with Metropolis, he brought in heritage, and then he continued with sustainability, and the way he linked together. Of course, we have to do the ground truthing and see how that 11.4 heritage conservation, heritage management can work with each of the targets of goal 11, plus each of the goals in itself, each of the 17 goals of the SDG. So thank you very much, Professor Turner. And in continuing with my vote of thanks, I would like to thank our knowledge partners, which is Cities Forum London, Center for Science and Environment, New Delhi, Institute of Spatial Planning and Environment and Research, Panchkula in Haryana. And for this particular lecture, I would also like to thank our knowledge partners, UN Habitat, UN Metro Hub, Universities Consortium, and Heritage and Metropolis, the Heritopolis, as Professor Turner has already talked about it. I would like to extend my gratitude to our chief patron, our Honorable Vice Chairman, Professor Dr. Jaspal Singh Sandhu, without whose approval and support, this distinguished lecture wouldn't have been possible. I would also like to thank our felicitator, Dean of Academic Affairs, and our Nodal Officer, RUSA, Professor Sarbjot Singh Behel. And I'm most grateful to our chair for today, Professor Dr. Ashwini Luthra, for his support always. And it is unfortunate that he took ill and he couldn't, in the last minute, he has to back out. And I'm so grateful, especially to the faculty and to Professor Kiran, from a senior faculty from planning, to chip in and saving the day. And last but not the least, most essentially, Arvind Bisht, who's at the backstage and who's our technical support, without whom this entire lecture wouldn't have been possible. And thank you for helping with the presentation. And once again, I extend my warmest regards to Professor Michael Turner, and thank you on behalf of Center for Sustainable Habitat and GNDU. And thank you all for being there till the end, and wish you a very happy World Metropolitan Day. So till we meet again, bye-bye. Thank you, Mike, again.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah.